comics, comics, comics.
Because they have no home.
I'm Special Agent Joe Getcho.
And I'm Special Agent Mike White. And this is an after show.
Except I have a badge and you don't.
I ordered one and it didn't come in time. So I will eventually have an FBI badge that I can do nothing with. So that's
will you have one that you can clip onto your jacket as well?
It's a lanyard. So I think it just goes around my neck. But everyone, please make sure that you've already watched or listened to our episode of The X-Files, Season 10, Volume 5, because the last time we uploaded an after show, 37 of you listened to the after show or watched it on YouTube before you watched the episode.
What are you doing?
That doesn't make any sense, does it, Precious?
It's after the show.
Let's watch this later because that makes more sense.
Watch our episode.
Honestly, we shouldn't be telling you not to give us engagement. So do whatever you want. But
yes,
don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube.
Yes.
It collect issues 21 through 25. I actually had a question about that.
Oh.
Were they published as individual issues or was it published as a trade? And this is just the 5th volume of the trade because it's broken up into chapters, but there are no covers in the trade. And that's really unusual. So I almost wonder if it was they were just released as trade volumes. In any case, it was written by Joe Harris and has art by Matthew Dow Smith, published in 2013 by IDW.
Yes, so they were released as individual issues. So the first one was released.
Okay.
Yeah. So issue number 1 was released June 19th of 2013. And actually, Elders Part 1, which was issue 21, was published in March 18 of 2015. So this story, this 5-part story actually was from 2015. But the comic started in 2013.
Began, that makes sense.
So instead of just
that's fine.
10,
get in the comments.
Yes.
And tell us how we're wrong.
So instead of just one season taking place over 1 year, this actually ran like almost 2 years because it was a looks like every other month comic. No.
Oh wow. Yeah. No, 2 years is about right for 24 issues or 25 issues. So
just the last couple, I guess.
That's about right.
I think the last one was a double-sized issue, so it didn't come out the month after the previous one. It was later. Anyway.
Yeah, just so they could effectively not wrap everything up.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to give you more pages so that we can give you more cliffhanger.
That's right.
So if you notice behind me in our episode, which you totally watched before this, or you listened to our podcast episode on your podcast platform of choice, and then you went to YouTube and looked at our episode so you could see what I was doing during the YouTube episode, which you've now tuned into this after show to watch. See, we got to keep things convoluted and conspiratory on this show. But behind me, you will see all kinds of X-Files memorabilia. So this is actually not mine. Well, I guess by association it is mine, but it is actually my wife's, who was a huge X-Files fan, who collected all of this stuff during her childhood growing up in the 90s. And I am super envious of her collection because she actually has action figures that are still original in the box that have never been taken out. And they're really
awesome, really
cool. So I have a lot of cool stuff, and I just wanted everybody to know about it.
It's funny. When you mentioned your wife, I was just thinking, as I was criticizing them becoming a workplace romance, that's totally where my girlfriend of 5 years has come from, is a workplace romance. So I really don't have any room to talk. It's so cliche. I know. I did it too. So just gonna put that out there. I do realize that I'm pointing at myself as well.
That's funny. Well, let's talk about another Joe, not me, but Joe Harris, who had the name before I did. Joe and Harris, but I don't have the name Harris. But anyway, I'm getting things too convoluted for myself. Yes. So Joe Harris, he is an American comic book writer and screenwriter. He got his start in the late 90s with Marvel Comics, where he launched the cult classic Spider-Man spin-off Slingers and The Bishop,
Oh,
the last X-Men series.
I've heard of Slingers.
Yeah.
I've never read it, but I remember seeing ads in my comics for it.
So he helped launch that. For DC, he wrote several issues of different Batman comics and also replaced Gail Simone as the writer on The Fury of Firestorm as part of the New 52 reboot in 2011.
Oh, wow. Okay, well then I own some of his work then in that case, because I do have all of the Fury of Firestorm collected.
Yeah.
So nice.
He made his big screen debut in 2003, where he conceived and co-wrote Darkness Falls for Sony Pictures, which was based on his short film Tooth Fairy, which presented a horrific twist on the children's bedtime myth, because
Awesome.
that needed to be scary. He's also written original comics and graphic novels such as the demonic rock and roll thrill ride Rockstars and the sci-fi adventure series Great Pacific and Snowfall by Image Comics, along with the supernatural thrillers Ghost Project with a K, and Spontaneous, and the children's fantasy Wars in Toyland, published by Oni Press, and the ghostly journey into the Fukushima nuclear exclusion zone Disaster Inc., published by Aftershock. So
wow.
Yes, he's written a
lot
lot
of indie comics.
Yep. So the premiere issue of the X-Files season 10 debuted in 2013 and ran for 25 issues. In much the same fashion, he wrote the in-continuity monthly comic book series, The X-Files season 11, and also another comic series just called The X-Files. He first became attached to the project after IDW asked him if he was at all interested in a comic adaptation of the series. He was an avid fan, so of course he said yes. He holed up for a couple of days and punched out a take on the material, according to an interview. He presented his ideas to IDW, who approved of the stories. He also had to get approval from 20th Century Fox and the series creator Chris Carter, who agreed to be executive producer for the comics. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, I'm actually excited to see that he wrote season 11, because that means that probably
he continued
we're not
his story.
going to be abandoning story threads.
Yeah.
Because typically one would want to continue what they started. So that's good to know that, hopefully it goes on with what he set up in part 1 or part 10, I guess. However you want to do that. The penciler for this story is, and inker actually, is Matthew Dow Smith. He is an American comic book penciler, writer, and inker with an extensive career both on media adaptation comics and also properties at the Big Two. And some of the adaptations he's worked on include Doctor Who, The X-Files, Mirror's Edge, based on the video game series, and even Supernatural. So yeah, a lot of stuff there that seems like it would kind of fit his stylistic choices. But we talked about it really briefly in the episode, but his work is characterized by a heavy emphasis on shadow, imitating and being influenced by industry contemporaries like Mike Mignola and Alex Maleev. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Alex Maleev, you get a lot of his work on Daredevil with Bendis around the early 2000s, and it looks very similar to what Dow Smith does. So while Mignola prefers to give his characters unique silhouettes, Dow Smith's characters tend to look more realistic, with the stylized elements coming in with his use of the color black. So he uses black to show defining characteristics instead of techniques like cross-hatching, and he doesn't overly detail his figures, instead leaving the impression of the figure or the character. But I think you talked about in the episode even where you were like, well, we may get one shot where they're detailed, and then it'll kind of go on to be like, okay, well, you know who this is now. And you kind of have that impressionistic idea of who they are, and you can follow it from there. So I actually found a blog that he put up, and so he was talking about his 21-year career by saying now it's old enough to drink, which is probably only funny to me. But while the medium isn't very lucrative, he's very fortunate to be in a place now where he has a regular gig, a sea of side gigs to fill up my spare time, and personal projects to fill up any extra time I might have used for sleep. So he stays very busy. Like he's often working on like an indie book and something for one of the major publishers at the same time, at least from what I could see from his work history. The blog stopped being updated in like 2016, though, unfortunately. So I don't know anything more current than that. But possibly due to his similar stylistic choices, he's worked on Hellboy and the BPRD with Mike Mignola actually writing instead of him. And so I first became aware of Dow Smith's work in the DC's Suicide Squad Hell to Pay series, which I believe is set in the Arkhamverse. It's not set in like mainline continuity. But I read that in DC Universe Unlimited. So, and I did not realize that it was the same penciler as this until I looked it up just now. So there you go.
Yeah, that's one of the fun parts about doing the podcast is seeing the writers and artists that, you know, maybe you wouldn't necessarily pick up on like, oh, that's my favorite or anything like that. But you go, hey, I've read something that they've done that I liked. And then when you look into them, you find out that they also did a couple other things that you maybe did like, or that you haven't checked out that you're like, I wonder if that's any good. I kind of like it, want to check that out. So I like doing this part of the I don't know what you call it, episode plus after show, this part of the thing that we do to be able to provide that information. And
it is a lot of fun, especially making those connections, like the Firestorm connection that you made before. I remember Gail Simone leaving the book, but I didn't remember who the writer was that took over afterwards. And to be like, oh yeah, it's the guy that wrote this comic today. Like, oh okay,
the X-Files comic that I kind of liked. Oh
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, another thing that I thought would be cool to do is talk about the X-Files series creator, Chris Carter, and give a little bit of background on him and kind of how the show became to be, because it's really interesting as I was digging into it, finding out more and more of like the things that either influenced him or how it came to be, and just made me really think that like, okay, the formula of what made this work really fits in the 90s, and taking out of that time period, you either have to tweak the formula or you back to formula, or you have to just, you know, keep it in the 90s somehow. But I don't know that in 2024 you want to see a TV show based in the 90s that's told more modern, because then that's when you get things like Enterprise and Discovery where it's in the past but it looks super futuristic. So anyway, now that I'm done ragging on modern Trek, Chris Carter. Chris Carter is an American television and film producer, director, and writer. He was born in California, graduated in 1979 from California State University with a degree in journalism, and was an avid surfer. So he spent 13 years out of college working for Surfing Magazine, a San Clemente-based journal, eventually becoming its editor. He took an interest in pottery, making hundreds of thousands of pottery pieces of dinnerware as a hobby. So he was definitely out of the gates doing something very different than he would wind up doing later in life.
Clearly, this is the normal career to become a successful filmmaker.
You be a surfer and work for a journal about surfing. I don't remember seeing any surfing in the X-Files, so I guess he didn't bring like his favorite surfboard and give it a cameo or something, kind of like Sam Raimi and his what is it, the Buick or whatever that he always shows in his films.
You know, that's surprising because there are a lot of horrifying things in the ocean. So they really could have easily done an X-Files episode.
Very true. Also kind of influencing him was the first Indiana Jones film, and was actually one of the reasons why he decided to pursue a career in filmmaking. So obviously he did get into filmmaking because that's how we got the X-Files, but it's just kind of an interesting start that he got there. So in 1983, he began dating Dory Pearson, who he would eventually marry, and who had connections which led Carter basically writing television films for Walt Disney Studios. Then he went to go work for NBC when he met the then president of NBC at a company softball game. So he runs into the president at a softball game and gets in with NBC. He writes a pilot called Cool Culture, which was influenced by his passion for surfing and experience with Surfing Magazine. So now he's writing about something that, you know, he loves, but the series was never picked up. But because of his work, a CBS producer was interested in hiring him for to be producer on a show that he was working on. But before that could happen, the producer from CBS went to go work for Fox as the head of its television production wing. So Carter was among the first wave of new staff hired in 1992 to develop material for the network. So it's really weird how Chris Carter got to Fox to be able to write the X-Files, considering that he wasn't really a science fiction person. He was a surfer, he was a writer, and he bounced from Walt Disney to NBC to CBS to Fox, and then, okay, we need something new, come up with something. And so he had childhood fondness for series like The Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, and Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was about a wire service reporter who investigates mysterious crimes with unlikely causes, particularly those involving the supernatural or science fiction, including fantastic creatures. The show focused on paranormal events occurring in a mundane, everyday environment and had a structure of independent episodes that are as if the reset button was pushed between episodes each time. So, sound familiar?
Actually, sounds really cool.
Yeah.
And yes, it sounds like the X-Files.
I don't know if we'll ever get to see it because as was common practice in the day when that show was made, they reused the VHS tapes that it was filmed on. So
oh, wow.
Yeah. So I don't know if we'll ever actually get to see that. But even if we did, it's probably so dated at this point that it wouldn't be enjoyable because we're just so far out of context. But it's still really cool that like this show in the 90s is based on all these different, you know, previous shows that came before it. And again, that's why I think it works so well in the 90s. Although
I do want to note one difference between that and the X-Files, and that is serialization. I know that the Twilight Zone is basically like every episode is encapsulated almost in its own universe, where like nothing in one episode of the Twilight Zone is going to affect the next one. The whole "there's something on the wing" thing is William Shatner from the Twilight Zone. Actually, that's where that comes from. Right. So, but it was, you know, it was an anthology series. It's something completely different every time. So while you can do that with the X-Files, there's definitely a hard narrative that follows through the entire show. Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the main shows that was experimenting with that in the 90s, along with Babylon 5, along with Deep Space Nine. You know, they all kind of were doing that around that same time. So,
but they still have a lot of super episodic episodes in a capsule. And sometimes even it's an episodic, like where something totally weird that they're going to investigate that we'll never hear about again. And then there's a little bit of a whisper of the overarching plot in a couple of scenes. So it's like the B story in the episodic one is actually the main story for the overarching. So it's kind of cool how they weave that in and out of the series. Another big difference, of course, is that in that show, there were fantastic creatures. And so when Chris Carter started talking about that, the producer was like, oh, great, you know, vampires, one of the central antagonists of the original series, would be popular with audiences given the interest being shown in the upcoming film Interview with a Vampire, which came out around the time the X-Files came out. So Chris Carter really hadn't been interested in much science fiction, you know, although aside from the couple references here, but he also drew inspiration from his friend who was the head of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard. I don't know how he was friends with this guy, but that's quite a friend to have. But his friend was doing some research and taking some surveys and found out that 3% of the population believe they have been abducted by aliens. Carter has then since spoken out about the impact that actually witnessing the hypnosis of an alleged abductee and meeting alleged abductees and UFO witnesses in general had upon his work in writing the X-Files. And he said, when I was writing about the phenomenon, it wasn't as a disbeliever, it was as a person who wanted to believe. So I think that really, like, one of the things that sets the show apart is that, you know, in the show, they do show us that everything's real and the characters are trying to figure out if it's real or not, but we as the viewer know it is from what we see. But it's also like a lot of things are left open-ended of, was there really a creature? Were they really aliens? Was it something by the government? Well, we don't really know. It could be something. And a lot of it is just like opening your mind to the possibility, Scully, that there could be more than just what science tells you. And I think
Right.
that's a big part of it too, is like, hey, we're not saying that a lot of these crazy conspiracy theories are necessarily true or not. What we're saying is open your mind a little bit that,
Yeah.
maybe there could be something else going on here.
Hmm.
So in another interview, Chris Carter said, I actually resisted the science fiction label in the beginning because the show is actually based in science. If it weren't for Scully, I think the show would just be kind of loopy. So the science and the accuracy
Hmm.
of the science is all important to the success of the storytelling. I think Steven Spielberg called Close Encounters of the Third Kind speculative science, and I would say The X-Files for me has always fit more into that category. So I think of Star Trek like that too, whereas, yeah, it's
Yeah.
science fiction, but it really is based in a lot of science fact that they have
Hmm.
kind of extrapolated or made fantastical for the show, but it's still grounded in science. And the X-Files is very much like that as well.
We were actually talking about this just last night with my family, because because of the date, we rewatched the Deep Space Nine episodes Past Tense 1 and 2, with the Cisco going back to the year 2024 on from August 30th through September 3rd is
Oh, it's
when
that
he's there.
2024?
So yeah,
Oh,
yes,
that's
it is
awesome.
2024. So
Doesn't that
we
man
were
look a lot like Gabriel Bell? Or doesn't this Gabriel Bell look a lot like
exactly.
Commander Cisco?
So the Bell riots would be happening starting yesterday through tomorrow.
Oh,
Is actually
yikes.
when those events would take place. So we were like talking about it and going like, there's some cheesy things, like they talk about the internet and they call it the net, and no one says, "Are you going to get on the net?" whenever they're logging on. But a lot of the speculative things, like the future just being like buried in endless red tape,
Mm,
that's actually pretty much true. And some of the things about how they were treating certain citizens and stuff like that too, it's like we're seeing places where that's happening. So it's like,
mm,
is it really that far-fetched? And then we even went further to think about like things like, well, communicators are basically what our cell phones are, except that they're way better than that now. Like we actually have portable computers, and they had pads on Star Trek, which again would have been just a dream to have all your computer stuff on this device. But now it's like we have tablets, and that's exactly what it is. So there's a lot of speculative fiction like that that actually becomes real. And
mhm.
so it is kind of interesting to look at that stuff and go, oh, wow, it's actually not that crazy of an idea. And here we are, like, not nearly as far in the future as they extrapolated. And like some of the things that they were talking about are technologies that we have now. So, yeah,
Right.
I think the X Files kind of fits into that as well, where it's like, we're looking at the modern day, but we're applying these modern scientific techniques to the unexplained things and seeing, can we explain them, basically. And that's a lot of the fun of it, is seeing
Mhm.
like, well, is there an explanation? Can Scully break it down into something that we can understand, or is it just going to be like, what, this person was actually just possessed and there is no scientific explanation for that?
Yeah.
So
It's like, Scully, you were lifted up in the air,
right.
moved 10 feet across the room, and slammed and pinned up against the wall, floating there. How do you explain that?
Hmm.
Oh, there were a
Right.
lot of windstorms going on and the window opened, and so the wind must have, come through at this angle to create like some kind of like rip current that just, shoved me against the wall. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
You're trying too
It's
hard
like,
to
when do
explain
you
it.
get to the point, yeah, where your scientific explanation is so far fetched, it's easier just like, maybe just accept that something crazy happens. That's
But
that's
at
more
the
plausible.
same time, though, they kind of do flip the script on Mulder sometimes, where he's so eager
Yeah.
to kind of believe somebody who says
Hmm.
something is going on, and then when he starts to dig into it, he's intelligent enough to realize that, oh yeah, this actually is a hoax, or this is fake, or something.
Right.
But sometimes, he's kind of left holding the bag of like, well, great, I just spent all this time looking into this thing that is completely kooky.
Hmm.
But at the same time, he can also see value in something kooky. He might find one piece of evidence or one tagline that somebody says that
Right.
99% of what they said was completely goofy, but one thing they said helped us solve this case. So he's really good at picking out those things, which is really cool to see.
Yeah.
Another influence on Chris Carter for writing the X-Files was the Watergate scandal, which Carter said, "I'm a child of the Watergate era, so I question authority and mistrust it. That was in my blood."
That makes a lot of sense.
There were a number of scientists hired on the show as consultants, including a University of Maryland microbiologist that said, "You're not there to tell the writer, Chris, you can't have a fluke man that's half man, half worm, but you want to come up with something reasonable." And so Anne Simon is the author of The Real Science Behind the X-Files, Microbes, Meteorites, and Mutants. So again, really cool that they brought in real science for the show.
Yeah.
He also looked to his brother for help, who was a professor at MIT. A lot of the things that are in the pilot came directly from him. Carter had said, "I wrote something about time and space, and my brother corrected me on my terminology." So again, somebody writing something fantastical, but then, taking that and making it sound more realistic. Some of the visual aspects, like you mentioned during the episode, were influenced by The Silence of the Lambs, which actually came out a year before the pilot was put into production. And so another commonality they have is the place and date stamps at the bottom left corner of the screen using that like typewriter type font.
That
was another
I didn't
thing they
catch
took from
that was
too.
a connection.
Yeah. And then Mulder and Scully themselves were based on the same witty, humorous, and platonic as romantic relationship found in the English television series The Avengers. This is not Marvel The Avengers. This is a English television series called The Avengers, and they actually had a spinoff called The New Avengers. But again, it's
gosh.
It has nothing to do with superheroes. It's a British espionage television series that ran in the 1960s. And then in the 2000s, it was ranked number 17 and number 20 on TV Guide's top cult shows ever. So this was a very big and influential show that actually on Frasier, which was another 90s TV show, he actually makes mention of the Avengers. And originally when I saw that episode and I heard him say the Avengers, I'm thinking like, Captain America? What does he have to do with this? But it was actually a British TV show, which was quite different than, superheroes and everything. But that was another influence on the X-Files. And then, of course, Mulder, kind of similarities between him and Will Graham in Red Dragon. Had Mulder not been banished to the basement with the X-Files, he probably would have gone on to be a top profiler, kind of like Will Graham was in Red Dragon. So a lot of similarities, a lot of things being drawn upon, but that's what you do in media. And it's kind of cool because again, it sort of gives you that perspective of, oh, there were other shows in the 60s and 70s that influenced this. And now the X-Files goes on to influence shows in the 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. So they kind of just like,
I don't think
the torch.
I don't think we have Fringe without having the X-Files first. To some degree, I don't think we have Smallville without having the X-Files first, oddly enough. Because the tone of the first couple seasons of that show is, yes, they're doing Superman and teen love stuff, but whenever they encounter somebody mutated by kryptonite, it feels very X-Files-y. It's like, well, this person is turning into an insect man, and this person is like eating other people, and all. It's very like dark and creepy and weird. And I remember at the time thinking, like, did they just like combine Superman with the X-Files? Is that what they're doing here? But yeah, it's definitely had an impact. One of the things you mentioned earlier that really stuck out to me was them having science consultants on hand. And that's something that really used to set Star Trek apart. It seems like now, and Discovery is going to be the obvious example, we just come up with crazy invention and we don't explain it. And I really miss that era of television where the writers were really concerned with, we want to get this as accurate as we can and extrapolate it from something real, as opposed to we're using mushrooms to travel across the galaxy, which is a little bit harder to believe, I feel like. So,
well, I think too, like Star Trek was kind of a little more procedural. in its episodes,
Sure.
whereas
Yes.
Discovery, I think it went a different direction with it, and so it didn't feel quite the
Mm,
same. But it's kind of hard because, like, and this would be a whole nother discussion of, is the
right.
procedural type TV show dead? Do we still want to see that kind of thing currently, or has it had its time and now we've moved on to something to keep and engage people's audiences? Because
Mhm.
along with having information at your fingertips comes sort of a almost short attention span where you're not as willing to wait for things because you're used to getting them quickly. So kind of going through
Yeah.
the sort of procedural dramas maybe is not the same as it was back in the 90s when information moved a little bit slower.
So that is something that I noticed about the comic book, and I mean that's why I only gave it a 4 out of 5. Is just the pacing was a little slow.
Mm-hmm.
But then the more I thought about it, I was like, but that's what the show is. It's very much we slowly go through, we gather the clues, we figure out what's going on, and then get some kind of a climax or cliffhanger, and then that's the end. And that's very much what they do in every episode of the X-Files. So it felt like the show, but yeah, reading it these days, it also felt like, okay, we're having a lot of long scenes of exposition and just looking at clues and trying to figure out what's going on, and you definitely expect a higher pace in entertainment today.
Yeah.
So
I'm
I don't
just
know.
glad that like we can watch the X-Files, even now, rewatch it and get
Mm-hmm.
into it and enjoy it without having seen all of these various different properties that influenced this work. Like
Oh
I've seen a
yeah.
couple Twilight Zone episodes here and there, but the rest of it, like I hadn't seen or heard of. Pretty much everything that Chris Carter said was an influence on creating the show. But
Mm-hmm.
well, except for like Silence of the Lambs or Interview with the
Sure.
Vampire, although that's not really an influence, but like it didn't I didn't start watching the X-Files and be like, oh, that's Clarice Starling. Like that's not Scully. Who the
Right.
heck is this?
Yeah.
It was more subtle than that. But I'm glad that we can watch it without having seen those things and still appreciate the show for what it is. And I hope that anybody who's born after, the 2000s basically can watch the X-Files and appreciate something about it, even though they didn't live through the 90s and they didn't
Sure.
see, these other references and things like that. I hope that it can still be appreciated, in some kind of way, because I feel like it's a really good show. And part of what makes it work is that Mulder and Scully dynamic of David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson. Although after
Yeah.
the last season in 2018 that didn't get really good reviews from critics, Gillian Anderson was basically like, I'm not going to play Scully again. I'm moving on to other things in
Yeah.
my career. So Chris Carter,
Yeah.
wants there to be more X-Files. In 2020, in an interview, he said, basically he thought there would be more. But he's planning to
Mm-hmm.
continue or he had plans to continue the franchise. Fox had announced that an animated comedy spin-off series would be in development, since again, Gillian has moved on, but they still
Oh.
want to tell X-Files series. I don't know how that's going to work, and I don't know if
X-Files
Disney's
Lower
going to do
Decks.
that, but hey, I mean, yeah, it could totally work, but I don't know. We'll see if there's more, but the future is unwritten currently for the X-Files. I almost think that somebody with like Chris Carter maybe needs to pass the torch to somebody kind of like Gene Roddenberry
Sure.
did, where although that wasn't voluntary, but you can take the core
Right.
ideals and the principles of what made the show work well and translate that into more modern times. Because I think
Mm-hmm.
it does need to change somehow. And especially if you don't have Mulder and Scully, how the heck are you going to tell this story? Because anybody else is just going to be a bad carbon copy, kind of like in our story,
Yeah.
where they were a person until they melted into a green bubble of ooze and were no longer a person because they were a bad clone. That's what happens when you try to recast Mulder and Scully with different characters. I mean, they
Yeah.
they sort of did it on the TV show when they had the T-1000 and what's her name, Reyes, I think, on the show. They like
Oh
had other
yeah.
people
Uh-huh.
kind of investigating, and after a while,
Dag
I
or
was like
Doggett
Daggett, I
something.
think. After a while, like I
Yeah.
sort of started to appreciate his character, but it was like that magical, you know, flair was gone from the series because
Right.
what made it work was Mulder and Scully. And maybe there's just
Right.
no way to capture that because again, it was the perfect formula in the 90s with these two actors, and we can't do that again. But maybe there is. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. It would take a very smart writer to do that.
The truth is out there.
And we want to believe.
We do. All right. Anything else?
Well, we have 2 minutes, so I think I'm.
Anything else?
I think
All
I'm
right.
good.
Well, this has been another after show. So tell us what you know in the comments, and hope that you like and subscribe and do all the things and enjoy our episode. And we'll see you next time.
Before you go.
I'm going to keep flashing this badge because this is the one time I get to show it. It's going to go in a drawer with all my other stuff.
And it's super cool. Is that
is.
actually a picture of you, or is it?
It is not.
Okay. It's hard to tell from here.
Yeah, I was going to do it, but then I was like, well, it's hard to tell on camera, so I'll just do it this way. But no, it's some dude.
Yeah. It kind of looks like Channing Tatum.
Oh,
no, it's Tom Welling.
Oh, it kind of does look like Tom Welling. But the one here is actually, that one is actually David Duchovny.
Oh, there we go.
Fox Mulder.
All right.
Thanks. We'll catch you next time.
Catch you later.
Green time,
Comics.
green